Looking forward to the future isn't always a cheerful exercise. We're going to talk about the future of mobility in the future of the world that we live in. And let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. Philipp, you have a lot of ideas on this subject. Can you sort of sketch the problem out for us?
Certainly, Stephen. Mobility is a basic need to all of us, and it is also the foundation for prosperity of a nation. So mobility is very important, but as we all know, when we get up in the morning, I think two things are very much on our minds. One is the weather, and one is traffic. And that already points to a fundamental problem or challenge that we have to address. And that is related to the global population and the population growth, especially in urban centers. Today's population is close to 7 billion, the global population, 7 billion people. By 2050, this population will grow by approximately 1/3 to 9.3 billion people. Now, whilst today just over half of the global population lives in urban areas, this percentage is going to increase to about 2/3 of the global population. That means that close to 2.5 billion people are going to move into urban areas, and you can imagine what strain that puts already on our already strained infrastructure. And that's what we have to address.
That seems like an urgent problem. Sasha, how do you see this? The context for all of these developments in mobility?
So I totally agree with his comments. I mean, I think today all transportation companies are solving a couple of the same similar problems. We're all trying to attack congestion, air pollution. I live in Boston where it takes me 30 minutes to go 2 miles. And so all of us are trying to attack the same set of problems, but from different angles.
Let's talk a little bit about how you attack those problems and how you calculate those angles. I think we've all spent a lot of time over the last day talking about autonomous vehicles and other forms of data-driven mobility. Sasha, why don't you talk to us about some of the lighter weight vehicles and devices that complement that infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple different initiatives really happening in the lightweight mobility sector. We ourselves just recently launched a product called JITA. It's a cargo carrying vehicle. And you can think about it as us wanting to enable someone to be able to extend their own human mobility and keep your hands free. But there's a lot of people working on different efforts that are 2- and 3-wheel types of platforms. So bike sharing, there were over 1 million bikes in bike sharing programs last year. That's increasing significantly. Maybe people have seen things like the one wheel. There are so many advancements being made right now in 1-, 2-, and 3-wheel, lightweight, electric, foldable platforms, things that you can use for last mile commuting. When you end up, if you take the train to work, but getting from the train station to your office, that last bit of distance, there are a lot of people tackling, creating solutions for those specific problems.
Philipp, how do you see these lighter weight, innovative vehicles and devices working together with more established traditional cars?
Well, we certainly need different kinds of vehicles going forward, and that's going to be enabled and facilitated by what Sasha already referred to, autonomous vehicles, electrification, and the sharing. And so we will have very dedicated vehicles for specific purposes going forward. So the scenery and the landscape we have in today's traffic environment is going to change over the next couple of decades significantly. So we will no longer see the sort of cars that we have on the roads today.
We often like to say right scale for the right task. So vehicles are starting to move into a point where we built our vehicle to be able to say, you don't need to use a car to deliver a pizza or to move one person. Why is it every time that I get something delivered to my house, I'm almost upset when it's a car that did it, because it's adding to the congestion problem. So how do we actually start using the right vehicles that are the right scale for any given task? So when we're talking about moving humans, it can be about public transportation when we're talking very large throughput into a city, but then to get you to that office, it's a different form of transportation that may involve walking or skateboarding or something that hasn't even been invented yet.
So could the two of you walk us through, say, a trip to the grocery store, but it's not around the corner, it's a grocery store across town and I can't walk there? How will these devices work together and how will I be directed?
So that's a little bit about, I guess I'll start into our vision of the future city, because I think that plays into there. So I think you're going to see 4 major constructs really coming up in the future city. One is less ownership, meaning that we really are operating in a sharing economy, whether it's cars, bikes, or anything else. We are utilizing platforms that are shared amongst everyone. The second one is that it's more information sharing. So at the end of the day, if there's not some sort of overarching platform that all of these vehicles and systems are connected into, you're only going to add to the problem because everyone is only optimizing for their own product instead of efficiency. I think you'll also see multimodal transportation. So this idea of how do you get to the grocery store, which I'll talk about. And then lastly, kind of looking at things that help you move seamlessly and efficiently in the most transparent way. So maybe that ends up being an app that is connected to all of these systems, and it tells you, you're going to drive your car to point X, and then from there you're going to walk, and then there's another form of transportation that you can share to get you that last way. And maybe that's actually a 10-mile trip. You're using 3 forms of transportation, but that's in fact the most efficient way to get there. And maybe you use a Jita or something else to actually carry all of your groceries home.
Philip, how do you see the car integrating with these other options? And in fact, you've experimented with them in some interesting ways.
Yeah, certainly, the car is going to play an important role for the foreseeable future going forward. It's just going to change in the way the car is going to be designed, configured, and for the dedicated purposes it's put to use. Now, to take your example with the grocery store, perhaps I'm not going to go to the grocery store,
okay,
but the groceries
else.
are being delivered to my house, so I don't need to even leave my home in order to do that, and might even be delivered by a drone. In order to answer this question, I'd like to step back a little bit and consider different city scenarios which we see emerging. And we've developed or defined 3 different clusters, and in each cluster you will probably find a different answer to this question. The 3 clusters that we see emerging and already exist largely today are, one is efficient collectivism. Those are cities that are highly regulated, standardized, and scaled mobility systems designed for efficient use. You find that largely in Asia, such as cities like Guangzhou. Other areas, like here in the United States or in the Bay Area and in other parts of the world, you have effective individuals really defining mobility needs. It's a liberal system with a very diverse culture, and everything is optimized and geared towards individual effectiveness and comfort. And then, thirdly, you have a group of cities that are really characterized by what we call overburdened sprawl. Those are cities that are very diverse, very unorganized, very chaotic in some places, and dependent on a DIY culture. Cities such as Lagos, for instance. And in each of those, you will have a different answer on how to solve those problems. Now, the simplest answer to your question of the grocery problem in, for instance, the efficient collectivism is that you're not allowed to travel halfway across town just to get a piece of meat. That will be forbidden because it's not good for the greater good of the city. It's got to be done differently. You will have to source it locally, or it will be heavily taxed.
Sasha, can you see these 3 different kinds of cities emerging, and who's really ahead of the curve and who's behind the curve right now?
Yeah, definitely. So at a core, I think everyone is trying to make cities more movable as a whole. And especially, we ourselves believe really in this vision of wanting to make people move more. We don't, right now in cities, I would say that sort of the romance of many cities is totally dead. They're devoid of life in a lot of ways. But you're seeing cities around the world trying to make an effort to really make people move more and do that in an efficient, seamless way. So Sheikh Mohammed of Dubai has said that by 2030 they want 25% of their rides to be autonomous. Singapore has put a ton of money into both robotics and smart transportation. They'd at some point like to get to a fleet of 300,000 autonomous cars to be able to service their population. In the United States, in Virginia and Idaho and California, they're starting to pass regulation around autonomous both vehicles as well as robots on the road being able to do deliveries. So you're slowly starting to see advancements being made, although I would say that in a lot of international international cities, they're happening faster than they are here in many ways.
They're not just international cities. Would it be fair to say that in many cases they're more autocratic systems?
Definitely. So, I mean, yes, there is a king in Dubai. There's a president in Singapore who pretty much can say, I want to invest X billion dollars, and it's going to get done. And you're seeing the fruits of a lot of that. There's an autonomous car company from Boston, Autonomy. They did all of their original testing in Singapore. We'd love to be able to get to a point where, you know, us in Boston, we'd be able to say we are a first mover now instead of following often many of the trends that are happening.
But even then, when we see what is happening in places such as Singapore, it will put a lot of pressure on the cities in our part of the world here to also make change happen and realize changes and change the system on how decisions are being made so that we can also benefit from those advances.
So how do we catch up, or how do we move forward in a system in which, ideally, there isn't an autocrat in place, and as you pointed out earlier, it's all about the individual?
Well, the answer is not to change the political system.
Okay, good.
No, but what we have to do is, as I said, we have to learn. We have to learn from best practice that we can see elsewhere. We have to certainly try to change within especially in the cities, the way decisions are being made. And technology is also going to play a role. We heard a lot about technology today. Technology is going to facilitate advances that previously were very costly to implement. And so you can execute some of the changes a lot faster than in the past.
I think it's really important, too, for companies to be very proactive in talking to cities. I mean, we've gone and done that. I think it's so important before you go and just release a product, have a conversation and learn about what a city's problems are. It's often you'll go in there and you'll think, oh, well, I'm helping solve X problem. But there's also 10 other dependencies that are as part of this mix. And as a city, you need to actually think about those and everybody else that's impacted. So in order to kind of get to this futuristic city, we need to have academics, regulators, businesses all really talking together and doing a lot more sort of rapid fire testing, creating zones that are meant to do this, and to actually have set goals and saying, if you can meet these goals, can we actually then create implementation and do it in a much faster way? I mean, we're not getting anywhere if the testing period takes a year for us to even formulate an idea, another year to test it. I mean, by this slow crawl pace, everybody else is going to be faster than us.
The New York Times had a story the other day that went inside the New York City subway system and found switching and signaling equipment from the 1930s. No joke. And it will be maybe 25 years before the entire system is computerized. So the reality is that the infrastructure, at least in the US, is nowhere near ready to facilitate any of these changes, is it?
So you're highlighting something that's important, which is infrastructure costs, right, as a whole. And we're talking about advancements being made in public transportation, autonomous vehicles, other types of shared platforms. That all takes a strain on the system, right? But yet at the same time, what we're trying to do is avoid all of these costs on the existing system. But you have to sort of put money in to see any fruits come out as well. And it's about putting that money in the proper way to the right systems. Public transportation's never going away. People talk a lot about how autonomous cars are going to solve all of our problems, but the truth is public transport, especially in the cities where people rely on it, it really can't be substituted. The throughput of the amount of people who go through public transport is not going to happen through autonomous cars.
Sorry,
go ahead. Stephen, even if the signaling is not modernized within the next 20 years, the system is working to capacity, I guess. And it's always designed to peak capacity. That's a challenge. You can actually, even today, generate the data that you need to actually optimize the system and make it work better and incentivize people to utilize the system in a more efficient way. And you don't need to upgrade the signals necessarily within the next 5 years rather than next 25 years in order to actually optimize the existing infrastructure.
I wonder if there's a new also revenue model to be made of all of this transportation. If we're moving into a world where it's a completely shareable platform, and let's say some of these are actually owned by the city, so in many cities where they have shared bike platforms, it's run by the city. What happens if we're now, instead of paying just for my subway ticket, I'm actually paying more per month, but it allows me to access different things, and you're able to take that revenue and use it to improve all of these systems. So I think there's a point at which we start to look at how do we create new revenue models where you're having, citizens paying into a system to get something that's much more efficient, but at the end of the day, it benefits all of us as well.
Phil, from your perspective, overseeing a global company, if the answer isn't changing the political system, is it, what is the answer? Does it lie more in changing the regulatory environment?
Yeah, certainly. I think it is, as Sasha already made a reference to, it is companies, large companies, and entrepreneurs lobbying the system and demonstrating the benefits of advances and changes, what impact they may have on the system, and working collaboratively with regulators, legislators to advance and facilitate changes to be made. It's certainly a very intense process, often a very slow process, but it's inevitable that we engage, that we have that dialogue, and promote the benefits of making changes to the system.
I'm not sure if the answer is at a federal level or a state level, but I do know that going city by city is also very cumbersome, or even town by town for that matter, for any given company. It is a lot of work, and it's true to say, though, that for any given city around the world or town, the effects are going to be different. But if you have to go city by city, it takes a lot harder to implement all of this as well.
And is that the way things are working now in the US and in Europe?
It is,
yep.
Yes.
All the regulations done individually.
Yep. I mean, the challenge, if you look at a city like Berlin, you have European legislation, you have national legislation, you have city legislation, as well as district regulations, and then parking, traffic, and other aspects of the public infrastructure that you use for mobility are also dealt with through different departments. So this is enormously complex, and unless also cities move towards simplifying that, such as, for instance, London. Transport for London is a very good example of an organization that tries to take this holistic perspective on mobility. And unless you do that, it will be extremely difficult to achieve progress.
Where are public attitudes right now? If the infrastructure and the regulatory system and the political system in many cases is an impediment, is public sentiment working in your favor?
Public sentiment in many ways, it's good and bad, right? It's important to create an efficient system, but at the same time, when you're introducing a lot of these products, they're brand new, right? And let's be honest, they often have a lot of kinks. I've interacted with a lot of these new, whether they're robots or they're vehicles, and a lot of times public perception, it really does matter. We live in a society that's a democracy. We care a lot about what people think, which is why so many things often start with small scale pilots, and people look at the reaction and the impact that it's actually having. Sometimes it takes a little while to get through those kinks, and that can be a problem because you'll kill something before it ever even had a chance to develop. And that happens as well.
We are driven by habits. And getting people to change the way they consume and use mobility is a challenge. You can motivate people, you can perhaps even incentivize them. That's often done through, for instance, in the case of transportation, you can do it through a tax system. But it is habits that you need to overcome. For Americans here, it is inconceivable why Germans still want to do manual gear shifts in their cars. I think they disappeared largely in the United States a long, long time ago, but Germans seem to like that. And so we need to deal with habits and not necessarily just through a very convincing product. You need to nudge people a little bit.
Are people coming around to the idea of sharing vehicles?
Very much so. Sharing is going to become much more easy, and you see a lot of car sharing, for instance, in Berlin. It's probably car sharing capital of Europe, I dare say. Especially in very dense environments, urban environments, car sharing is a very attractive solution, and people often don't want to own a car anymore and want to share it. Or vice versa, they have a car and they also want to earn money by renting it out to others, as we heard earlier from Getaround, for instance.
Last question. 3 years from now, how much do you think we'll see a tremendous amount of change, a little bit of change, or no change? Sasha, we'll start with you.
So when it comes to autonomous systems, I think that you're going to start to see the sort of good effects of autonomous vehicles and that technology being used in a lot of different ways. So like autonomous trucking, for instance, I think will become much more prevalent. Uber just recently did one of their first freight trips that was completed successfully. You'll also start to see it, I think, to use more for like safety things. So if I'm on the road and I'm swerving, or if you have a drunk driver, maybe the car actually notices that pattern and it's intelligent enough to actually take over. So I think that you'll start to see it used in more safety type of capacities. I think you'll also see many more cities actually having testing zones. I know for a fact now that there's multiple cities working on pedestrian-only zones. So I think that within a couple of years, you'll start to see the groundwork for a lot of areas that are meant to have really just walkable areas, but like no cars allowed. And I also think that you're going to start to see significantly more robotic vehicles on the road, whether autonomous or following humans, being used for everything from delivery to carrying cargoes, and other just general autonomous systems being used.
Yeah. Philipp, do you add or subtract anything?
Well, in the short term, in the next 3 years, we would see a lot of data-enabled improvements in city traffic. So that relates to traffic itself, making it perhaps more efficient, optimizing traffic and traffic flows, and also, of course, understanding traffic better. And other models, such as in car sharing that we refer to, those are the models that we will see a lot more of, parking-related solutions. That is the advances that we will see in the short term, because they're low-hanging fruit, they're easy to implement, you don't need the regulator to do very much to facilitate that. And
I also think 3 years from now, you'll see a ton of platforms that you have not seen today. I mean, we've started alluding to flying cars and drones doing delivery. I think there's 20 new systems that haven't even been developed yet that 3 years from now will exist.
I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Stephen.
Thank you.